Remember the chicken I painted? My patrons loved painting it, and they asked me if I would paint a rooster as well. So I did. And in this video, I'll share a few different watercolour techniques with you. With this painting, I wanted to include a soft background splash of colour. And I thought where I put the background colour, I could also include some lost edges, just to help add some depth. I also decided to graduate the colour from the head down to his feet. I wanted the darkest colours and most of the contrast up near the head. So as I moved down the body, I faded the colour away. In my last video, I showed you some blending techniques in the circles that I painted on wet and dry paper. In this video, I'll show you how I use some of those techniques. I also didn't want to get lost in the details of those feathers on his neck, so I tried to simplify them as much as I could. I'll show you those things and a few others, and if you want to see the full-length version of this tutorial from start to finish, you'll need to join me on Patreon. Before we have a look at the rooster, I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is a huge online community that has thousands of classes for creative people like you who are hoping to learn new skills. From painting in watercolour to photography to graphic design to marketing. I'm always keen to learn new skills and improve myself, so I'm often on Skillshare working my way through some of the classes. I shared recently that because I work from home, I don't have a good work-life balance. I find it hard to switch off, and you'll often find me working late at night. And I know that's not sustainable, so I turned to Skillshare to help me start to build better work-life habits. I've just worked my way through this class on How to Build Habits That Last by Thomas Frank. Thomas shares some helpful advice about setting realistic goals and ways that you can achieve them. Now I'm learning to focus on specific goals that I want to achieve, and I'm starting to track my progress. On Skillshare, there are thousands of classes on hundreds of topics for different skill levels from beginner to advanced. Type in what you're looking for into the search bar and you'll find hundreds of classes. Classes on Skillshare are ad-free, so you can stay in the zone while you're learning new skills. New premium classes are launched each week, so there's always something new to discover. And the entire library of classes are now available with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese and German. If you would like to explore the Skillshare class library completely free for 1 month, there's a link in the description of this video. The first 1,000 people to use the link will get a 1 month free trial of Skillshare. Okay, back to this rooster. The paper that he's painted on is Arches cold pressed watercolour paper. This is 640 GSM in weight, so it's quite thick. And the paints that I used were Winsor & Newton professional watercolour paints. The reference photo that I used was taken by Pexels from Pixabay. I transferred my line drawing of the rooster onto my paper. I've left a lost edge here, and I've got another lost edge down here where I won't be putting any paint, and that will help to create some depth. Okay, just where I've got my little lost edge here, I'm going to wet the rooster. So I take the water onto the rooster through that lost edge. And then I also paint the water onto the background. I paint it on in a larger area than where I'll be putting the paint. This is a Da Vinci Casaneo flat brush. It's a number 20. So I've taken that water onto the rooster and on a big area in the back. I'll use some Winsor & Newton Naples Yellow. I paint some of that onto the rooster itself on the back, through the opening, and then I paint it onto the background really loosely. I'm holding my brush right back here, trying to be as loose as I can. The paper's nice and wet, the paint's fairly wet as well. Okay, I've got a fair amount of paint there. I'm going to just lift the board off the table and I'll let the paint flow over the water that's on there. Down here I've got that lost edge on the leg, so I'm going to put some water in there, and then I'll drag it out onto the background as well. And again here I wet an area larger than where the paint will go. That's because I don't want the paint to flow all the way to the edge of the water, creating a hard edge. I want to try and keep the paint edges soft. And then I paint some grey that I mixed. This was French ultramarine mixed with burnt sienna. I painted onto the rooster through my opening there and then onto the background as well. And then I hold the board off my table to make the paint move and flow across the paper. And I accept what it gives me. And then I use my brush to soften any hard edges that might be forming on the rooster itself. I dried the background off and then I re-wet the yellow feathers that are on the neck of the rooster. Okay, I'll start here, right where the colour's lighter. I'll keep the paint away from my lost edge here. This is Naples yellow, the same colour that I used on the background. And I'm going to blend some other colours into this. Okay, now I want to switch colours. This is transparent yellow. It's still a cool yellow, but it's different to Naples yellow. I'll mix some water with it as well. This I will paint on the tips of these yellow feathers, and it will bleed into the Naples yellow. The reason I've started with the yellow feathers is because they're the lightest. The areas that surround the yellow feathers are darker, and I can take the darker paint into the yellow a bit if I need to tidy up any edges. Okay, my paper's still quite wet. If it was starting to dry, I'd need to dry it off and re-wet it with water. Now I want some burnt sienna. I'll paint that right up the top here near the head. The paper's still wet. That burnt sienna is bleeding into the Naples yellow that's wet. Take it right up to the top of the head. Up there where my brush is now, the paper's dry. I've just patted my brush on my towel to get rid of some of the paint, and I'm just going to pull a little bit of that down just to soften that edge there where the burnt sienna meets the yellow. I need to paint in the chest or breast feathers now, and I want a really dark colour for that. So I'm squirting out some fresh paint. That's French ultramarine, and I'll squirt out some fresh burnt sienna. The reason I like to use the fresh paint when I mix a dark colour is because I don't have to add water to my brush to pick the paint up. If I add water to the brush to pick the paint up, it makes it not as dark. So I make sure the brush is fairly dry, and then I pick the paint up. I'll use these two colours, the same colours that I used for the grey. But as I said, there'll be a lot more pigment this time, less water. When I change colours, I wash the brush and then I dry it on the cloth before I pick up the burnt sienna. I try and keep as much moisture out of the brush as I can. Fairly even mixture of both colours. I should give you a black. It's really quite sticky because there's no moisture there. So that's not going to move at all on my palette. When I lift it up, you can see it's not moving at all. I've just been wetting the body with water. The The water on the paper will help me get that soft gradation of colour, and it will also help me to get the paint on there easier. I'll start with the lighter section down the bottom. So what I need to do is move some of that dark, thick paint away from the main puddle to create a lighter puddle. So my brush is nice and wet. I just drag some of that colour over here, which will give me a grey rather than the black, and it will be quite a bit lighter. And I'll paint that down the bottom, down here. Even though it's quite dark on the reference photo, I'm altering that. This is going to be fairly light down here. I've just picked up a bit more water on my brush to make sure it is nice and light. Here on the front, I've got my lost edge, so I'll keep the paint away from there. I'm trying to make this colour the same tonal value as the background colour, so that the edge will fade off into the background. That gives me that lost edge. Okay, now I want darker paint, so I'll use my wet brush to pick up this dark sticky paint. And then I paint that on. Because the paper's wet, the two colours or tonal variations should blend together gently by themselves. I might have to use my damp brush just to tease them together. And I keep taking that paint all the way up to meet up with those other feathers. So here is where I use my damp brush to feather that edge together so that it blends more with the lighter colour. You saw me do that in last week's video with the circles and the lemons. Here I've mixed some burnt sienna with French ultramarine again to make a brown. I've used more of the burnt sienna. I'm using it to define the bottom of some of these feathers on dry paper. Just take the paint out of my brush now and smooth that edge away at the bottom. I painted in the comb and the wattle and the red skin around the eye. And here I've got some burnt sienna. It's full mass tone, or the colour that it comes straight out of the tube. And I'm darkening the feathers on the top of the head. I'm painting on dry paper. On the reference photo, there's lots of feathers here, and this is where I didn't want to get lost in the detail. So I thought I'd make it as simple as I could just by painting a few directional flicks or long strokes with my brush. And that gives the suggestion of some long, thin feathers here. There were some fluffy white feathers at the base of the tail. To paint these in, I had to paint on the wet paper because I wanted fuzzy edges on the paint marks. So here I'm wetting the paper with water. I've got some of the grey mixture that I used on the front of the rooster, the body. Here I'm patting that colour onto the wet paper, and that gives me those soft edges. These are white feathers, so I don't want to completely cover them with paint. I want to leave quite a bit of white paper showing. But I just want some fluffy edges and some grey areas down here. And I let the paint move on the water, and I try not to fuss with it too much. The wet paper gave me those soft fluffy edges here, but with this section along here I painted in some hard edges. I pulled the paint from the long tail feathers back into that area. I painted that on dry paper and I left more of a jagged edge along there. So here I'm painting some green paint onto the feather, and then I pull it into those white feathers to create that jagged edge there. And then I soften the paint edge here. I painted in all the tail feathers, and then I deepened the contrast in some areas by painting a few more layers until I was happy with it. If you want to see the full-length tutorial of this painting, please join us on my Patreon site, where you'll have access to my line drawing, progress photos of my painting, and a copy of my finished painting as well. Please give this video a like and don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you soon with another video. Because it feels like I'm in the middle there, not here. Remember that, oh, I've got the giggles now. And I'll see you soon with another video. My voice went then. And this is really awkward because my son's here filming with me today, and it's really embarrassing with him standing there and doing this, this.